He was a godly man, an imperfect man, and wanted to tell the entire world about his imperfections.
Duck Dynasty, they're rallying behind the star of the hit cable TV show.
For decades, Phil Robertson seemed unbreakable.
Duck Dynasty star Phil Robertson has passed away at the age of 79.
A man carved out of the Louisiana swamps, built on faith, grit, and raw conviction. But in late 2024, behind closed doors, something was happening that no camera ever captured. Something his family was quietly fighting, day by day.
Robertson family from TV's Duck Dynasty, and they're famous for being entrepreneurs and, of course, the duck hunting as well.
What began as a simple diagnosis became a rapid, heartbreaking decline that none of them were prepared for. The patriarch of Duck Dynasty, the man who lived through storms, controversy, and redemption, was slipping away faster than anyone expected. And when he passed in May 2025, the world thought the tragedy ended there. But they were wrong. The final chapter of a man once unbreakable. In the months leading up to May 2025, the Robertson family began facing a reality they had spent years hoping would never come. Phil Robertson, the man who braved storms, built an empire from the swamp, preached with unwavering conviction, and stood as an immovable pillar of their family, was beginning to slip away. To the outside world, he had always appeared invincible. But inside the Robertson home, the cracks were growing impossible to ignore. When the family announced in December 2024 that Phil had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, fans reacted with sympathy but optimism. Many believed the condition would progress slowly, giving the family several years before the illness significantly altered his life. But the truth behind closed doors was far more devastating. The decline did not creep, it crashed. Signs that once felt minor quickly evolved into symptoms that frightened even the strongest members of the family. At first, it was harmless things: misplaced hunting gear, repeated questions, forgotten names in the middle of conversations. But as the weeks passed, those moments expanded into prolonged episodes of confusion. Phil, the man known for his sharp memory and precise storytelling, sometimes struggled to recall conversations from earlier that same day, or became lost in his own backyard. As winter turned to spring in 2025, the disease accelerated in ways none of them were prepared for. There were days when Phil failed to recognize longtime friends, and moments when he would begin a sentence only to lose his train of thought entirely. Each lapse was a reminder that the man who once seemed carved from stone was now fighting a battle he could not possibly win. By April 2025, the family could no longer hide the truth from the public. During an episode of the Unashamed podcast, Jace Robertson's voice wavered as he finally admitted what they had all been enduring. "He's not good. We're making him comfortable." Those few words said everything. The patriarch of the family was fading. His body weakened to the point where simple routines required help from others. His once powerful voice, the same voice that stirred audiences, led prayers, and commanded television screens, became soft and fragile. Even speaking for long stretches exhausted him. And yet, remarkably, Phil remained calm. He had spoken openly about death for years.
His family broke the news of his death Sunday in an Instagram post, writing, quote,
"Never with fear." He viewed it as a transition, not an ending. He often told his children, "When I die, don't cry, dance, sing, but don't cry." He repeated those words so many times that they became almost a family proverb. But when the moment finally arrived, none of them could obey him. In the early hours of May 25, 2025, Phil Robertson passed away at home, surrounded by his wife, his children, and the people who had shared his life for decades. He was 79. The moment was peaceful, but the emotional weight was immeasurable. Jace was the first to share the news. "My dad has gone to be with the Lord today." Willie and Corey followed, writing messages filled with grief but gratitude. Gratitude for the years they had, gratitude for the man who shaped them, and gratitude that his suffering was over. The funeral that followed was exactly what Phil would have wanted. No cameras, no crowds, no reporters searching for headlines. It was private, raw, and intimate. A small gathering of family and lifelong friends. They prayed, they laughed, they cried. They remembered the man who raised them, taught them, challenged them, and loved them. But strangely, it wasn't the funeral that broke them. It was what happened the next day. Inside the quiet walls of a lawyer's office, they opened Phil's final letters, handwritten notes he had prepared long before Alzheimer's began taking his mind. Those letters revealed truths, confessions, blessings, and instructions. And in that small room, surrounded by pages written in shaky ink, the family realized something profound. Phil's final days were not merely about his death. They were about preparing his family for life without him. The will that broke their hearts. Letters, legacy, and a final goodbye. The morning after Phil Robertson's funeral, the family found themselves gathered once again. This time, not in a church, not in a living room, but in a quiet lawyer's office in West Monroe. The heaviness in the room was unmistakable. They were still wrapped in grief, still processing the fact that the man who seemed invincible for decades had slipped away only hours earlier. Now, they were preparing to hear his final wishes. Miss Kay sat closest to the lawyer, her hands folded tightly in her lap. After more than 50 years of marriage, she felt the kind of silence that only comes when half of one's soul is missing. Around her sat their sons, Alan, Jace, Willie, and Jep, and beside them, Phyllis, the daughter Phil embraced late in life with open arms and no hesitation. Together, they braced themselves for what they believed would be a straightforward reading of an estate: property, money, business shares, and legal instructions. But what came next felt nothing like business. The lawyer gently opened a folder and revealed a stack of envelopes. Each one was addressed by hand, the names written in ink that trembled slightly from the unsteady fingers of a man battling Alzheimer's. The room froze. No one had expected this. Phil had written personal letters for each of them, not typed, not dictated, not drafted by an attorney. Just Phil, raw, imperfect handwriting. The words of a man who knew his mind was fading, but was determined to speak clearly one last time. One by one, the family opened their envelopes, and with each letter, the room grew heavier. Some notes were long, some short, some filled with memories, others with apologies or blessings. They were not financial explanations. They were emotional confessions, simple, unpolished pieces of Phil's heart, written before the disease could silence him. The will itself was only a small part of what they received. Phil's fortune, estimated between $10 and $15 million, was the product of decades of carving duck calls by hand, building Duck Commander from nothing, turning a family business into a cultural empire, starring in Duck Dynasty, writing books, speaking across the country, and becoming a prominent voice in conservative Christian media. But what mattered to the family wasn't the money. It was the meaning behind every decision he made. Miss Kay was given full ownership of the family estate, the land where they had raised their children, built their lives, fought through poverty, and celebrated miracles. That home held their entire history, and Phil wanted her to hold it forever. Alan received Phil's lifelong collection of religious writings, journals filled with prayers, notes, scriptures, and reflections from the years after Phil's spiritual transformation. To the eldest son, who once preached from a pulpit, Phil passed down the spiritual torch. Jace and Jep received their father's shares of Duck Commander, not simply as assets, but as guardianship. In his letter, Phil told them plainly to protect the tradition, a reminder that the company began not as a brand, but as a story of survival woven into the swamps of Louisiana. For Phyllis, the daughter he found late in life, Phil left land along with something far more valuable, a deeply personal apology. He wrote about the years she lived without knowing her father, expressing regret for time lost, but gratitude for the chance to make up even a small part of it. Her tears flowed quietly as she read his words, and then came Willie's letter. As the son who transformed Duck Commander into a national phenomenon, he inherited the controlling stake of the business. The message Phil left him was brief but powerful. Protect the faith. Protect the legacy. In that moment, Willie understood the responsibility his father was passing on, one that went far beyond business decisions. By the time the final envelope was opened, the emotional weight in the room was overwhelming. They grieved again, not because of what they inherited, but because the letters made something painfully clear. Phil had spent his final months preparing these words, knowing he would not always be able to speak them. He had planned his goodbye long before Alzheimer's began its rapid work. And now, reading his final messages, the family finally understood just how deeply he had loved them. His will didn't divide his family. It united them in grief, in memory, and in the legacy he trusted them to carry. It was not the money that broke their hearts. It was the man behind it, the father, the husband, the patriarch, speaking to them one last time, in ink that shook, but meaning that stood unshaken. A legacy built in the swamps. To truly understand why Phil Robertson's will carried such emotional weight, the family had to look backward, back long before Duck Dynasty, before wealth, before fame, before any cameras pointed their way. Everything Phil left behind came from a life forged in hardship, shaped by the mud of Louisiana's swamps, and the discipline of a man who learned early that survival required both strength and faith. Phil was born in 1946 into a level of poverty that most Americans today can hardly imagine. His childhood home had no insulation, no luxuries, and sometimes barely enough food. Hunting wasn't a pastime, it was survival. Every meal, every winter, every day depended on what he could track, catch, or shoot. Fish, squirrel, duck, these weren't trophies. They were dinner. That upbringing carved something permanent into him: toughness, resilience, and an unshakable sense of self-reliance. Yet Phil wasn't defined solely by hardship. He possessed a natural athletic talent that lifted him temporarily out of the swamps. His ability on the football field earned him a scholarship to Louisiana Tech, where he became the starting quarterback in 1966 and 1967. Behind him on the bench sat a young Terry Bradshaw, the man who would later lead the Pittsburgh Steelers to 4 Super Bowl victories.
Phil Robertson?
Duck Dynasty.
That's him.
That's him.
The Duck Dynasty patriarch.
Anyone else in Phil's position would have fought for a shot at the NFL. The path was there. The opportunity was real. But Phil never wanted stadium lights. He wanted the woods. He walked away from football because the season interfered with duck hunting. The world thought it was madness. To Phil, it was clarity. He once joked that he'd rather hunt ducks than let big, sweaty men stomp him into the dirt. But beneath the humor was truth. Freedom mattered more to him than fame. That decision set the course for everything that followed. In 1972, he took the most important leap of his life. He began carving duck calls by hand in a shed behind his house. He named the business Duck Commander and sold each piece by mail, one order at a time. It was slow work, often thankless, with no guarantee it would ever grow. Meanwhile, Miss Kay stood beside him through every struggle, pregnant at 17, raising their children, cooking meals from whatever Phil brought home from the bayou. Those early years were brutal. There were times when the Robertsons lived on rice and frog legs, times when the electricity bill went unpaid, times when their faith was the only steady thing they had left. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, Duck Commander gained traction. Word of Phil's craftsmanship spread. Hunters trusted the sound of his calls, and the business that once barely scraped by began to flourish. Everything changed again when Willie returned home from college with a vision far bigger than Phil ever imagined. Willie saw potential, branding, marketing, expansion. Under his leadership, Duck Commander grew from a family shop into a national empire, setting the stage for the cultural explosion that would come next. But through all the evolution, the TV shows, merchandise lines, book deals, appearances, Phil remained the same man he was in childhood. Rugged, direct, unyielding. The empire grew around him, but it never reshaped him. This constancy was why his will struck the family so deeply. The fortune he left behind wasn't simply the result of success. It was the product of a lifetime spent fighting, building, failing, rebuilding, and trusting God through every storm. His handwritten letters, framed by the backdrop of his humble beginnings, reminded his family that every dollar, every acre, every piece of the brand carried history within it. The history of a boy who hunted to survive, a young man who walked away from fame, a husband who battled his demons, a father who rebuilt his broken life, and a patriarch who used faith as the compass for everything he touched. When the family finished reading his letters, they didn't cry because of inheritance or responsibility. They cried because they knew the truth. Phil hadn't left them wealth. He had left them purpose. And every word he wrote echoed with the same message he had lived by. Remember where we came from. Honor it, preserve it, carry it forward. Fame, controversy, and the man who refused to bend. When Duck Dynasty premiered in 2012, millions of Americans were introduced to Phil Robertson for the first time. Not as a quarterback, not as a struggling young husband, not as the quiet craftsman carving duck calls in a shed, but as the bearded patriarch of a Louisiana empire. The show was supposed to be simple, a light-hearted look at a family business built around duck hunting. Instead, it struck a cultural nerve and exploded into one of the most watched reality series in TV history. At its peak, over 11 million people tuned in every week to watch the Robertsons sit around their dinner table, laugh, argue, pray, and share their unapologetic country values. To many viewers, Phil wasn't just a character, he was a symbol of old-school American grit, a man who spoke plainly, lived simply, and prayed before every meal. For fans who longed for authenticity, he became a refreshing reminder of a world they felt was disappearing. But fame tends to act like a magnifying glass. It doesn't create flaws, it exposes them. And Phil was never a man built for filters. As the show grew bigger, his bluntness turned from entertaining to combustible. In 2013, a GQ interview ignited one of the most explosive controversies of his career.
Phil Robertson got in trouble last week for talking about vaginas and anuses. He told GQ magazine, "It seems like, to me, a vagina."
Phil spoke with his usual certainty about homosexuality, sin, and the Bible, echoing convictions he had held his entire life. But the world beyond West Monroe did not receive those words quietly. Within hours, headlines erupted. Advocacy groups condemned him. Advertisers pulled support. A&E suspended him, briefly, hesitantly, as public pressure mounted. Commentators on both sides of the political spectrum debated not just his words, but what he represented. For the first time, the Robertson family found themselves in the middle of a cultural firestorm they never asked for. But something unexpected happened. While many condemned Phil, an even larger wave of supporters rose up behind him. Social media lit up with hashtags defending him. Stores sold out of Duck Commander gear. Politicians weighed in. Churches across America rallied. It was as if a single interview had become a symbolic line in the sand. Phil, however, remained unbothered. He refused to apologize, insisting his beliefs came directly from Scripture. He didn't soften. He didn't retreat. He didn't compromise. A&E, overwhelmed by the backlash from Phil's supporters, reinstated him within weeks. Love him or hate him, Phil Robertson was not a man who bent. Over the years that followed, he became more than a reality TV star. he became a political and religious figurehead. He endorsed Ted Cruz in 2016. He later supported Donald Trump. He appeared at conferences, churches, and rallies, speaking with the same fire he used in his younger years when preaching in Louisiana's small-town churches. To conservatives, he was a warrior for faith. To critics, a stubborn relic of outdated ideals. But fame and controversy, even when embraced, have a cost. Behind the scenes, the Robertson family grappled with the weight of Phil's outspokenness. Producers pushed for more episodes, more public appearances, more branding. Fame had turned them into a franchise, but it also turned their private lives into open targets. Rumors circulated, judgment flooded in, and every misstep, even the imagined ones, were magnified by millions of viewers. By 2017, Duck Dynasty ended after 11 seasons. The empire continued to grow, branching into new shows like Going Cyril, At Home with the Robertsons, and Duck Family Treasure. The brand remained strong, but the immense public exposure had taken its toll. The family was older, more guarded, more aware of the emotional cost of letting the world into their living rooms. And by 2024, when Phil's Alzheimer's diagnosis became public, fans saw the once brash patriarch in a new light. The man who had ignited political debates and commanded TV ratings was suddenly vulnerable, his mind slipping away in ways that even fame couldn't shield him from. Yet even during his decline, the voice on the Unashamed podcast still sounded remarkably clear. Listeners couldn't reconcile the diagnosis with the conviction in his tone. It was as if the disease could weaken his body and memory, but not the part of him that believed, preached, and stood firm. The Phil the world debated, the controversial figure, the cultural icon, the man who refused to bow to public pressure, was only a fraction of the truth. His family knew the rest. The man who knelt to pray before meals, the man who fixed broken fences in silence, the man who taught his children that faith mattered more than fame, and conviction mattered more than applause. The wealth he gained was real. The empire he built was lasting. But the philosophy that guided his life, that stubborn, unshakable commitment to what he believed was right, was both his greatest strength and the greatest weight his family inherited. And in his final instructions, written with an unsteady hand but unwavering conviction, that same message echoed, "Stand firm, do not bend, honor what matters," the farewell that closed a chapter. When Phil Robertson's will was finally read, the room fell into a silence thicker than grief. The funeral had already drained the family emotionally, but this moment, the moment of hearing his final words, carried a different kind of weight. It was no longer about mourning the man they had lost. It was about facing the future he had prepared for them long before his mind began to fade. His death on May 25, 2025, did not come as a surprise to the family. In truth, they had been bracing for it since the diagnosis became public in December of the previous year. But knowing the day was coming did nothing to soften the blow. Phil had always seemed larger than life, unyielding, fearless, almost mythical in the way he lived. To watch him decline, to see the disease drain his strength and distort his memories, felt like watching a pillar of their world crumble. By early April, Jace had broken the silence on the Unashamed podcast.
First, I was just uncomfortable with it, people coming up wanting to take pictures, because I'm just a simple guy.
Admitting through a cracking voice that their father was no longer doing well. "We're making him comfortable," he had said, a short sentence that carried the full weight of the truth they had all been avoiding. Their listeners heard concern. The family heard finality. Yet in the weeks leading to his passing, Phil somehow managed to hold on to fragments of himself. His voice remained steady enough to record a few final episodes of the podcast, moments that now feel like a goodbye disguised as routine. Listeners were stunned, unable to reconcile his clarity with the diagnosis the family had described. But his children understood. When a man has spoken with the same conviction for 50 years, even a failing mind struggles to quiet that voice.
My life Don't ever give up on yourself. Give your life to God. You'll be surprised.
When the end finally came, it was quiet. No doctors rushing in, no monitors beeping, no chaos. Just his family gathered around him at home. The place he had always insisted was where he wanted to take his final breath. Miss Kay held his hand. His children whispered prayers. His grandchildren lingered in doorways, absorbing the gravity of a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. Phil slipped away in the early morning hours, embraced by love, leaving behind a silence so heavy it pressed against every corner of the house. The funeral was exactly the way he would have wanted it. Simple, private, untouched by the world that had once placed him under a national spotlight. No cameras, no reporters, no political figures eager to appear on the right side of history. Just family, a few close friends, and the quiet hum of prayers rising into the warm Louisiana air. They told stories. They cried. They laughed in the way grieving families do, through memories that now felt sharper, brighter, painfully precious. But the moment that broke them did not happen at the funeral. It happened afterward. In a small lawyer's office in West Monroe, the family gathered around a wooden table to hear the reading of Phil's will. They expected legalities, property distribution, and maybe a few business directives. Instead, they were handed envelopes, handwritten letters Phil had composed before Alzheimer's began to steal his stability. Miss Kay's hands trembled as she opened hers. Inside, Phil had entrusted her with full ownership of their estate, but the words that followed mattered more. He thanked her for saving him, for standing by him in the darkest years when addiction nearly tore their marriage apart. He told her she had been his anchor, his joy, and his redemption. Alan received Phil's lifelong collection of biblical writings, the notations, the lessons, the pages worn from decades of use. It was a passing of spiritual responsibility, a torch handed from one preacher to another. Jace and Jep were given their shares of Duck Commander, not as a reward, but as a duty. Phil urged them to guard the tradition, to protect what their family had built long before the cameras arrived. Phyllis, the daughter he discovered late in life, opened her envelope to find land and an apology, raw, honest, and heartbreaking. A father acknowledging the years she spent without knowing him, and the years he missed watching her grow. And then there was Willie. He inherited the controlling stake of Duck Commander, along with a message that summed up Phil's entire worldview in 3 simple sentences. There were no grand gestures, no elaborate estate maneuvers. The wealth he left behind, estimated between $10 million and $15 million, was significant, but it was not the reason tears filled the room that day. The letters revealed a man who had prepared for this moment with intention and love, a man who knew he would not live long enough to guide his family through the next chapters. So he had written his guidance instead. Each word carried the weight of his failures, his redemption, and his unshakable faith. And in reading them, the family realized that his final days were not just about dying. They were about ensuring they had the strength to keep living without him. Outside that office, the world prepared to move on. A&E announced the revival of Duck Dynasty, this time led by the younger generation. The franchise Phil helped build would continue, but now as a tribute to the man who shaped it. Though he would not appear on camera, his presence would echo through every storyline, every prayer, every lesson passed down. Within the family, grief slowly intertwined with purpose. Willie stepped into his leadership role. Jace and Jep resumed their work on the podcast. Miss Kay adjusted to life both emptier and fuller, empty of the man she had loved since she was a teenager, full of the memories and legacy he left behind. Phil Robertson's death marked more than the passing of a patriarch. It marked the end of an era, a way of life forged in the swamps of Louisiana, shaped by hardship, anchored in faith, and carried forward by a man who refused to be anything other than himself. In the end, his fortune mattered, but his message mattered more. His final words, written in a shaky script that reflected the fragility of his final years, reminded his family of one truth: wealth can be spent, fame can fade, legacy is what you choose to carry. A future forever changed. In the weeks following Phil Robertson's passing, the Robertson family found themselves facing a new reality, one shaped not by the presence of the man who had led them for decades, but by the space he left behind. His absence wasn't loud. It didn't echo through the house the way grief often does. Instead, it sat quietly in everyday moments: the empty chair at the head of the table, the silence during morning coffee, the unanswered instinct to ask him for guidance. It was the kind of loss that didn't shout. It whispered. The public mourned, sending thousands of messages across social media, sharing memories of how Phil's words, humor, or unwavering beliefs had shaped their own lives. But for the Robertsons, the grief was more intimate, tangled in the routines and rhythms of a family that had always looked to Phil as their anchor. Some days were heavy, others were astonishingly normal, but every day felt different. Miss Kay, who had stood beside Phil since she was a teenager, carried the heaviest silence of all. For over 50 years, her life had been intertwined with his, from the early days of poverty and chaos to the heights of national fame. She had weathered storms most marriages never survive, yet she had remained steady, forgiving, and fiercely loyal. Now she was navigating a world without the man who had both broken her heart and rebuilt it. Over time, the shock of losing him softened into something different, a sense of stewardship. His children began to focus less on what they had lost and more on what they had been entrusted with: faith, family, work ethic, resilience, conviction. These were the treasures Phil had left behind, far more valuable than land, money, or business shares. And slowly, the Robertson family stepped into the future with a new understanding. If Phil's story moved you, inspired you, or revealed something you never knew, let us know in the comments. And before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so more people can discover the life, the battles, and the powerful legacy of a man who refused to be anything but himself.